Okay, so we are almost to the Reformation, but there are still some denominations that actually started before the denomination that came out of the Catholic Church. So I want to talk about them tonight. Just kind of, after dumping all those carbs on you, I'm going to talk a little bit of history. So, Catholic kind of golden age for the Catholic Church. So when we kind of closed last week, we were up to about 600s or 700s. So figure the Middle Ages, 500 to maybe 1100 was really a pretty good time for the Catholic Church. A lot of theology that we use today is developed by Augustine, who you've heard us talk about, a guy named Anselm, who developed a lot of theology that we still use. And then the final guy that kind of the trio of kind of Catholic theologians was Thomas Aquinas. He's the guy that developed the 5 proofs, if you've heard of them, of God's existence. So, one thing, as it became the Roman Catholic Church, one thing they were doing very well is developing theology during this time. Another thing was missions. By the time you get to kind of the 1100s, you've got missionaries that have been up into Germany, up into what we would consider the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, all those countries, England, Ireland, Scotland, all those places that had missionaries sent to them. And most of what we would consider Europe was Christianized by this point. So the Catholic Church, at least at that point, was very good. And also they really served as kind of a bulwark for civilization. You've got major... you've got the Huns that come through. You've got the Mongols that come through. The Catholic Church did a good job of keeping kind of the learning around in their, monastic areas and their universities that they were creating. So a lot of stuff that was around during Roman times, the Catholic Church kind of kept that together. They kind of drew some of the government together, during this time. So, but as you move past that, we get to the not so golden age for the Catholic Church. By the time you move into the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, it really starts going downhill pretty quick. You eventually get to where you have more than one pope. At one point in time, there are 3 popes, all put into power by various political groups. So, how can the Pope be the voice of Christianity and be infallible when there's 3 of them, or even 2 of them, and they don't agree? And at one point, one Pope is held captive over in France, in Avignon, I believe, and basically kidnapped and held there, while there's another Pope over in Italy. So, the whole this bishop that we talked about, that's God's voice, passed down from Peter and all this, begins to fall apart during 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. And all this stuff is going to lead us up to why people like Martin Luther and these guys began to want to reform the church. You have a number of plagues. This 13th century is when you have the Black Plague that hits. And in Europe, it begins to kill a lot of people. You have a mini ice age that begins in probably 1300s and goes all the way up to the 1800s. Crops fail, people starve to death. And of course, things like this, we understand them, right? We all agree on exactly what to do when we have a plague and how to deal with it and the vaccination and all that. That's a joke, by the way. But, back then, they looked at things like plagues and, the weather changing. I mean, that was a religious thing. And so this is, they lose faith in the church. Why can't the church stop these things? They're God's hand on earth. Why are these things happening? Why are crops failing? Because it's too cold. People starving to death. Because back then, people lived pretty much, crop to crop. And then this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but what we begin to see is kind of the rise of the middle class. Up until this point in time, you've had feudalism. So you lived out somewhere and you worked for the Duke and, you did whatever he told you. And he supported you and you supported him. And that's the way things work. But as cities begin to develop, trade begins to develop, you start having middle class, people who have money, and people who are able to have influence. So it's not just a royalty. And we'll talk a little bit about what that kind of means. And then, of course, the printing press. Prior to the printing press, books were super expensive. They had to be handwritten. They had to be copied down. So very, very few people had books. But printing press, it's not like today, but it still begins to print Bibles. People begin to get Bibles and books in their hands. They begin to, one of the things I've talked about all through this is this idea that when somebody reads the Bible for themselves, what happens? How do they look at authority now? Maybe they question authority. They look at this and they're like, wait a second, why do we do it this way when the Bible says maybe we should do it this way? So you get all these things kind of coming together, and suddenly people are asking questions that maybe they've asked before, but now they have a reason to have something to back up their answer. Any questions about this? All these things, this is real quick, but I don't want to bore you with all the details. But the reading of Bible for oneself is probably going to be one of the main driving thing with all the denominations that we have today, especially today. Because, if I don't like the way Doug's teaching, I think we should do it this way. What can I go do? I go start my own church. Maybe it's a Baptist church. Maybe it's a Mark church. Whatever it wants to be. Because, so people are able to look at the Bible, decide for themselves, which is good, but it can be used for ill.
They didn't have commentators back then?
Yeah, there were commentaries, but they were Catholic commentaries. So really, as we go into the Reformation and when things really begin to change, these are kind of the four driving questions that are constantly going to come up. And they come up for us today. We talk about these things. How is a person saved? Well, you look at the Catholic Church and you begin to see what they have. Well, people like Martin Luther and some of them begin to look at the Bible and they're like, wait, I don't see any of this stuff in the Bible. I don't really see it happening that way. That isn't what Jesus talked about. Where does the religious authority lie? Does it lie with the priests? What do you mean the Pope has power? We don't even know what happened to Peter in the Bible. All these questions become very important. What is the church? What is this idea of church? No one had really asked these questions. Maybe they did, but they asked it within the context of the church. And then what is the essence of Christian living? All these questions we still struggle with today. Or do we have rules? Do we have that? So these are really going to drive this type of stuff, the Reformation, and even up until today. What's the answer to that last question? What's the essence of Christian living? What's the most important part of living as a Christ follower? Probably every one of you guys might have a different answer. What? Somebody give me an answer. What's the most important thing to you?
Being a disciple of his teachings.
Huh?
Being a disciple of his teachings.
Okay, being a disciple of Christ's teachings.
Be baptized.
Baptized.
Your family centered around God.
Family centered around God.
Be more like Christ.
More like Christ.
Love one another.
Yeah. That's very simple, but that's what Christ told us to do. But what does that look like? Think about the Sabbath. What is that? If you think about it, Jesus fought with the Pharisees about the Sabbath probably almost more than anything. So, it's obviously a big issue. But what is a Sabbath to you? Do you even take a Sabbath? Do you only do it on Sunday? Like I know, not to point Bubba out, but I know Bubba and them are very particular, surprisingly enough, about not going out to eat. They go out of their way on a Sunday to try to not make someone else work to do something for them. Isn't that right? Yeah. So even they go to a gas station, they fill up, they usually won't even buy anything. Or, they don't go out to eat, these kind of things. So that's one of the ways that he feels God has led him to deal with the Sabbath, So rules, well, how do you do these things? And these are going to be important questions in all the denominations. Anybody have any comment, anything? All right. So the first guy I want to talk about real quick is this guy John Wycliffe. He lived in England. He taught at Oxford. He taught what everybody taught, theology basically. And as Wycliffe begins to read his Bible, he begins to want to make some changes. He begins to preach about some changes that he sees should be made. The first thing he talked about is that clergy was corrupt, but nothing ever happened to them. So he began to say that the English government had a responsibility and the power by God to, if someone was corrupt, to remove that person from office. Now, this was not the way the church worked. The church did not answer to any government at this time. And that had been kind of set up. So when he begins to preach this, the government likes it, but the church doesn't.
Is this before the Church of England?
Yeah, this is all...
Everyone was still Catholic?
Yeah, everybody's still Catholic. There's nothing but Roman Catholicism, and then, of course, Orthodox.
Wasn't with 1500s?
No, probably like 1300s, I think, or 1400s. So he says you should relieve corrupt clergy of their office, and if they have property, to take that property away from the church. I mean, this was major upsetting to the church. He said that the priests don't have any special powers. The Bible does not say that a priest has the ability to talk to God on your behalf. The Bible says that you can talk to God on your behalf. The priesthood of the believer. Once again, very much against the way people looked at things.
So basically, was he the first one that said a priest couldn't forgive you?
Maybe not the first one, but maybe not the first one, but one of the first ones that had an audience. Because all of these things had been happening, people were seeing the same thing. So when he stood up and preached about it, people were like, okay. And he's a member of the church clergy kind of himself. You know? Huh?
Did that start because they were seeing hypocritical clergy,
Yeah.
or did that start because people were reading the Bible?
A little bit of both. I mean, Wycliffe is reading the Bible. He knows clergy's corrupt, but he looks at it and he's like, well, the Bible doesn't even talk about priests being in between me and God. You know? He says, the Pope, what should the Pope be? He said, well, if you look at Jesus, the Pope should be like Jesus. He shouldn't own anything. He should just go around and he should teach. And, you know, he should lead the church by being an example. Of course, the popes, like I said, the whole papacy kind of fallen apart. It turned into money and all of this stuff. So, well, another thing he begins to say is everybody needs a copy of the Bible in their language. And this is new, this type of thinking. People begin around this time to begin to think of themselves in terms of, I'm an Englishman, or I'm a Frenchman, or I'm German. That hadn't really happened before. So these national identities surrounded kind of language. So Wycliffe begins to translate the Bible into English. And actually is able to do that. And even though the church tries to excommunicate him, nobody pays attention to it in England. England's already a little different. So he actually dies of a stroke that he has while he's in the pulpit preaching. I think he dies a few days later, but nothing happened to him. Now later on, they dig his body up, burn the body and scatter the ashes because they're mad at him. But, you know, a lot of what Wycliffe did was groundbreaking. And the other thing is he had people who followed him. And they were called the Lollards, Lollards. And they would go around, think Doug's sermon that he's been preaching on the last 2 weeks. They followed that. They wore a robe that was very uncomfortable, no shoes, took no money with them, and had a staff, and went and lived off of people. You know, they had no money, and just went around preaching. And they took with them little Bible pamphlets, and also portions of this English Bible they took with them.
Was it a chick publication?
A what?
Chick tract, yeah.
Yeah. It was a Beth Moore study. No, but I mean, they took this stuff around with them in England and overseas, and they began to make a difference. Because, I mean, here these guys are. They're out. They're wandering the countryside, teaching about God, helping people out, and it begins to make a difference. So these followers in England, they kind of fall out. But they get to this country that we basically consider Czechoslovakia, Poland area, that area. It was called Bohemia at the time. And this guy named Jan Hus is kind of a similar type position to Wycliffe. He begins to see these lollards and begins to see these Bibles and begins to study. Same thing as Wycliffe. And then he begins preaching. Now, I tried to find pictures of this because this is pretty ironic. This is a God thing. So they had just built a brand new chapel in this city in Prague, the Bethlehem Chapel. And inside this chapel, they had put all these beautiful artwork. And only God could trick man into doing this. So you would have a picture of the Pope riding a horse, dressed in finery, beautiful jewels and all this. And then you'd have a picture right next to him, because he represents Jesus on earth, of Jesus, in a simple robe, walking everywhere. And then the next picture showed Jesus washing people's feet. And then next to that is people kissing the feet of the Pope. So this Jan Hus guy, he's reading his Bible and he's like, all he's got to do is walk in and say, well, let's look at these pictures right here. Jesus walked everywhere he went and he didn't own anything. Why is the Pope riding a horse and dressed like this? Jesus washed people's feet. Why does the Pope expect people to kiss his feet? And so these pictures are all around this church. Now they've since been taken out. And so what a perfect thing. He's just able to say, look at these pictures here. And he begins to get followers. And one of the things that he drove home that he wanted to do, he wanted people to be able to worship in their language. The Mass at that time was in Latin. This was another way to control it, where only the priests knew Latin. He's like, no, this should be in the Czech language, so anybody can understand it.
So before the national identity stuff and these guys translating into national language, German, English, whatever, all of the scholarly books, they were all Latin.
Pretty much,
right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Religious, even educational?
Probably almost everything was Latin. Yeah, exactly. So, well, there are some masses like this. There's this little church over on a golf course, a little bitty church. They're a Latin thing. But this guy's point is, look, why not have it in Czech? That way they can understand, and see what's going on. And he wants changes also. The language thing. He wants the Mass. He wants priests to be able to marry. He said the Bible doesn't say anything. Matter of fact, it says Peter was married, And so he begins to do that. And then this big thing that was going on at the time called indulgences. I know we've talked about this before. This is basically the Catholic Church sold these. So you pay your indulgent salesman $10 and he'd give you an indulgence. It's basically one free sin. You can go do whatever you want to. You're already forgiven. So it's kind of like, I'll gladly pay you on Thursday for a hamburger today. And these were everywhere. The church sold them all the time to raise money to build stuff. And it also helped to get your relatives out of purgatory. The ones you wanted out. Some of them you may want to stay in there. But, because you could also have the priest say a prayer for one of your relatives who you're pretty sure is in purgatory. And
even murder?
Huh?
Was that even for murder? Or?
No, I think murder you'd be in hell.
No, I mean the indulgence.
I'm sure there were some rules. There's a famous story. This guy Tetzel was one of the best salesmen, and one guy said, "No, leave it blank." When he bought the indulgence from him, he said, "No, don't write anything. I want to save it." And then the guy robs him of all his money, and then he writes on the indulgence, to get out of theft. That's some good thinking right there. If you think about it, I'm going to steal all your money, and you just gave me a get out of jail free card, so I don't have to pay for the sin. But these things were big, and the idea of purgatory, he wanted to eliminate that. He said this is not in the Bible, So he begins to attract attention and followers. The only difference is in Bohemia, good King Wenceslaus doesn't support him, and he actually gets captured, excommunicated, captured, and will eventually be burned at the stake, alive, of course. And it's kind of interesting. They would chain your neck to the stake, and then they'd build a all the wood around you in there with it right to here. And his last words, somebody wrote them down. He said, God, they asked him right before they lit the fire, the priest asked him if he wanted to recant, and say, I was wrong. And he said, God is my witness that the things charged against me I never preached in the same truth of the gospel which I have written, taught, and preached, drawing upon the sayings and positions of the holy doctors. I am ready to die today. So, and then he burned to death. So, think about that, going on. So, so what do we get out of this guy? Well, Wycliffe kind of just disappeared after his. But actually, Huss's followers actually went and started some denominations. They started other churches. And this is all before Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation kicks off. So this is 1400s. Some of them would just kind of meet together and eventually would become Lutherans. When Martin Luther started the Lutheran Church, or it began to go, these guys just joined that. Some of them joined started what's called the Unity of the Brethren. And this is a church that still exists today. You could become a member of it. And also a group called the Moravians. And also still exists today. So these are the oldest active denominations outside of the Catholic Church around. So we think of Lutheran or Presbyterian, but these actually started before that. So let's take a look at them. The Unity of the Brethren, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic begin to go. And anybody want to guess where the most of these guys are in the world right now? Most churches.
Russia.
Nope. Come on. They're Czech. They're Czech.
Eastern Europe?
Think United States.
Oh.
Has anybody been to A&M? Driven around Central East Texas? You see brethren churches all over the place. The largest concentration of this church in the world is in Texas. Going all the way from Caldwell, Texas, down to like College Station. You drive through that area, there's brethren churches all over the place down in that area. And still around, still operating. They believe pretty close to what we believe, except they're what's called Paedo-Baptists. They believe in baptism for infants. And it's kind of hard to pin them down. So the Catholics believed in this idea of transubstantiation, right? That the bread and the wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. It actually, when the priest does Mass, it just becomes that. Consubstantiation is a Luther thing. That he wasn't fully willing to give up on that, so he said, well, it may not turn into it, but he's all around it. But I don't know that it was ever really developed as a main theology. It's like he's in it, he's around it, but he's with it, but he doesn't actually turn into it. So
the word etymologically means with the essence.
Yeah. So
the Spirit of Christ is with the essence of the bread and the wine.
yeah, so it doesn't turn into it. It's like a force thing or something. I don't know. It's like dipping Oreos. It's like your bread gets dipped in the essence of Jesus. I don't know, but they tend to believe in this also. Just for you, Jeff. So the other one I want to spend a little bit of time talking about are the Moravians. Now the Moravians became super well known for their missions. So when they first started, they maybe only had 300 members. They started sending out missionaries because they felt like that was Matthew 28 that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to send it. Now the interesting thing about the Moravians, they sent missionaries all over the world. They became very well known for sending missionaries to like slaves and prisoners and third world countries. Well, they weren't third world countries, but places no one else went to at the time. And they sent, I'll get to that in just a second. So their missionary movement, they sent people to the Arctic to reach out to the Inuits. They sent people over here to reach out to the Cherokee, and Mohican people. They sent people to South America. Matter of fact, there's a country called Suriname right off the coast of South America, the northeast coast, and it is almost all Moravian because they had so much success getting those slaves to become Christians that it's still the main church there. They sent people to Africa, to the Far East, all these places. And they just became well known as missionaries. If you ever go to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, they have the old Moravian village there. You can go there. It is where Krispy Kreme, so this would be a good reason to go, actually began, because the guy there used a combination of a donut recipe he had and the Moravian friendship bread that they make to make Krispy Kreme. But I want to read you a couple of things. One thing real quick. So, does anybody know who John Wesley was? He's the guy that would start the Methodist Church. So John Wesley was a priest in the Anglican Church, was sent to Savannah area. And while he was there, he fell in love with a girl, and she married someone else, so Wesley wouldn't give them communion because he was mad, and some other things, so they sent him back. So even though he's a priest, you read his writings, he wasn't a believer at the time. Well, while he's going, he rides with these Moravian missionaries on the ship. I want you to listen to what he said. He said, "At 7, I went to the Germans." This is from his little log he kept. "I had long before observed the great seriousness of their behavior. Of their humility they had given a continual proof by performing those servile offices for the other passengers, which none of the English would undertake, for which they desired and would receive no pay, saying it was good for their proud hearts, and their loving Savior had done more for them. And every day had given them occasion of showing a meekness which no injury could move. If they were pushed, struck, or thrown down, they rose again and went away, but no complaint was found in their mouth. There was now an opportunity of trying whether they were delivered from the spirit of fear, as well as that of pride, anger, and revenge. In the midst of a psalm wherewith their service began, the sea broke over the ship, a big wave came over, split the mainsail into pieces and covered the ship, and poured in between the decks as if the great deep had already swallowed us up. A terrible screaming began among the English. The Moravians calmly sung on. I asked one of them afterwards, 'Were you not afraid?' And he answered, 'I thank God, no.' I asked, 'But were not your women and children afraid?' And he said, 'No, our women and children are not afraid to die.'" So, these guys were just well known for their missions work and living out this peaceful, kind of a pacifist style lifestyle. And so there's a lot of them. There's probably 750,000 Moravians around the world. And when you look at their theology, it's kind of interesting because they divide things up into what they call essential and ministerial things. So they say, what is the essentials of our faith? They look at their faith and they say, what are the essentials? And then what are the things that are left over are the ministerials. In other words, they help you. So preaching, so robes, Lord's Supper, all this type of the sacraments are all ministerial things that help you in your faith, in your walk. And they phrase it like this. It says, one way to understand the essentials is to think about what it was like to be a member of a Moravian church 5 centuries ago. If the Inquisition imprisoned your bishop, burned your Bibles, closed your church building, and prevented you from having baptism or Holy Communion, could you still be a Christian? Yeah. You could, right? Not going to change that. So in their point, having a Bible, having a minister, having these things, while they're important, they are not essential in their eyes. They are what they would call ministerial. So being able to do the Lord's Supper, being able to have deacons. So they're not going to argue about them. They're not going to fight. If you want to do it this way, fine. If you don't want to do it that way, fine. And they boiled down the essentials. And then they also said, if you were a missionary and shipwrecked in the Caribbean and had no Bible or communion set, could you still preach the good news of Christ? If so, then none of these things are essential. However, if not, then you need to look at things. So they're big on Bible memory. So their idea is, so kind of an interesting approach to things. And like I said, they're still around. You can go find, they actually have an app. I downloaded it. It's called the Daily Word. And so each day you get verses from them that all their church prays through, that they send out to all their churches, so that you can pray through. So, both of these groups started out as denominations, and before you even get to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. So, anybody have any questions about these guys?
Are there many here in the United States?
I want to say it was like 70,000 or something that are in the U.S., so they still have churches around. Bill?
I mean, you said they were close to like with the Baptists?
Their beliefs are similar to ours. They do believe you can baptize children, but they don't believe you have to. They also hold to a believer's baptism. So, I mean, their service would not look like one of our services, probably. They would have a preacher,
So they would baptize an infant, but upon, your acceptance of Christ, you baptize again.
you could be baptized again. Once again, this whole thing of the essentials driving things, It might be in one church, it might not be in another. So,
Is there preaching from the Word, their Word, or is it?
no, they're preaching from the Bible.
From the Bible.
Yeah. So, I mean, these guys have been around for, 600 years almost. I mean, and also the Brethren Church is very similar. See a lot of crossover with the Mennonites that we'll talk about in a couple weeks. And these guys, a lot of Moravian Mennonites and stuff. So it's more of a thing called pietism that we'll talk about. So it's kind of leading up to Martin Luther and the Reformation, which we'll start next week. But I just thought it was kind of interesting that these two groups started even before then. And were persecuted, killed, quite a bit.
What happened to the writing of Wycliffe? You said he wanted to change things. Did he change the Bible?
Who?
Wycliffe?
No, he just translated the Bible.
Just translated.
He took the Latin version that they had, and he translated it into English.
Okay.
And then John Huss translated the New Testament into Czechoslovakian. So this is something that's going to drive it. This is what Martin Luther, because now you got this printing press, so you can print this Bible and give it to you if you can read. Because at the same time, you're starting to get development of schools. The idea of being able to read is becoming more and more important.
Was there much lost in translation from their translation?
No, Wycliffe translation is probably pretty accurate. I mean, these guys are Latin scholars.
Oh, okay.
I mean, he's not, and Huss was a scholar. So now this is all prior to your King James Bible, which we'll talk about when we get to there, which is totally different. They're translated out of the Latin version of the Bible, which wasn't the Greek, I don't know if you call it mistakes, but some bad translations in it.
Luther ended up doing that for the German translation.
German, yeah.
And the thing about those translations that's interesting is those translations codified languages, which was one more thing that helped to solidify nations. Because basically everybody was in tribes and groups, and when you codify a language and you're all speaking that same language, it creates a sense of national unity. That's another contributing factor to the nationalism, the identification as a German, not just as this particular tribe or this particular clan. And it codifies language, and because of what Luther did, the Germans speak the way they do today.
Yeah, I mean,
what Wycliffe did, we speak the way we do today because of what he did.
Yep. I mean, we don't realize, especially like Wycliffe and the King James Version Bible, which we look at and maybe think it's archaic, but that did more for the English language than probably anything else, other than maybe Shakespeare. But King James Bible had way more words in it than Shakespeare had. So, I mean, like Doug said, we don't think of these as that big a deal, but these were a big deal. I mean, imagine you've just learned how to read and write your language, and now you got a Bible in it. You can read it. No one's ever been able to read it in your family because they didn't read or write Latin. So suddenly, I mean, imagine it's happening. This is part of the reason when this thing finally lights up and takes off, it just takes over. I mean, it goes like crazy through Europe.
Could you imagine learning to read by using the Bible to do that?
Most people did back then. I mean, I would say probably even up to the 1800s, people learned how to.
Probably up when I was in elementary, we read the Bible in class where we learned to read.
In Hebrew with Moses? No, but you're right. I mean, they still, Eugene and the guys in Moldova, they use the Bible to teach kids how to speak English. I mean, that's one of their things. Now, they teach them English grammar and all that, but a lot of their readings is out of the English Bible. I mean, so it's still extremely effective tool.
And another reason it took off is because the clergy who were trained preached in the language of the people. And it was no longer in Latin because, what percentage of people spoke and understood Latin? Hardly anybody but the clergy. So you go and you sit in church for an hour listening to a guy speak a language you don't understand.
Yeah.
How engaging is that? These guys are speaking the language of the people. That's why, like you say, it just spread like wildfire.
Yeah. Singing songs you don't understand in Latin, So, imagine that. We complain because maybe, we don't like this song because of this. But imagine all the songs not even being in a language you even understand. So, anybody else have any other questions? So, what this does sets us up. We'll move into the Reformation next week. But I think when I first started studying this stuff, church history, I always thought Martin Luther just stood up one day and changed everything. But you see that this stuff was already building and building and building. So.
And it's more than just those two guys.
Yeah, there were other guys too. These are just two, and especially I wanted to go with Huss because of the denominations that came out of this. So if you ever go to Winston-Salem, go to old Salem. It's pretty cool. Still Moravians around there. Yeah, we went there, didn't we? All right, that is it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank y'all. All right, about